Good morning. Welcome to Bryn College and a special session of Business 302, Corporate Social Responsibility. I'm Bergen Youngie, the instructor for the class. And it's my pleasure this morning to welcome students and alumni to a guest lecture from one of our BAC alumnus, John King. Mr. King is the co-founder of CAB Solutions, a Feasterville-based company which provides elevator remodeling solutions. Prior to forming CAB Solutions, Mr. King was a CFO of Fortress Investment Group's Drawbridge Funds and an EVP of the Brickman Group. Mr. King began his career with Goldman Sachs in New York City, where he was a founding member of Goldman's Structured Finance Group, a director of GS Mortgage Securities Corp, and a director of GS Mortgage Asset Management Corp. If we go even farther back than Goldman Sachs, Mr. King got his finance degree from Lehigh University and his excellent foundation for success from studying at BAC. Welcome, John.
All right, thank you, Mr. Youngie. Appreciate being invited to speak to students here primarily. I love speaking with young people and students in particular at college level. 35 years ago, I sat actually right where you're sitting now, and it honestly feels like way longer than 35 years. Mr. Youngie mentioned the text that you have for this class, Strategic Corporate Social Responsibility by David Chandler and William Werther. What I plan to cover over the next 30 minutes, assuming there's not tremendous applause and delays, would be first a brief background of getting my first job. That's basically moving from where you're sitting now to being employed. Second, a review of the culture at Goldman Sachs during my 14 years there and how it shaped my professional life thereafter. Third, a very shallow, and I stress very shallow dive of what I actually worked on. That would be mortgage-backed asset securitization and the whole derivatives market. Fourth, a review of the community or players involved with the mortgage-backed derivatives market and industry, some of the stakeholders, if you will. And finally, corporate social responsibility with an eye towards the 2007-2008 global financial meltdown. So I ask you, does that sound ambitious? Well, that's one of my worst faults, so let's get started. My background. I was here at Bryn College from 81 to 82 for my first year. Then I finished up at Lehigh University. Both institutions were excellent and prepared me well. I had the technical knowledge to be able to start my career, but thanks to a liberal arts education, also the ability to think and to write, to debate and convince, and most importantly, to continue learning as I made that transition from a student to a professional. I have no doubt that all of you will be equally prepared, and just quite simply, Bryn College is an excellent institution. Another factor for me was, jump back. Another thing that I did was interviews on Lehigh campus, which were very unproductive. Lehigh was not known for Wall Street in any way. They were an accounting and engineering firm. So I eventually hopped on a bus and went to New York City and started the intense process of interviewing on Wall Street in 1984. I eventually chose Goldman Sachs, and although the other offers that I were given were also from Wall Street competitors, the interviewing that I did was quite extensive, showed me what an eclectic group Wall Street represented. So why Goldman? There were really many reasons. The interviewing process itself introduced me at Goldman, believe it or not, to over 20 men and women, and all of the professionals I actually liked. This was not the case at some of the other companies that I interviewed at. Some prided themselves in being intensely competitive internally, which is great. They were very successful firms, had excellent reputations, just didn't engage me personally. There were other interviews that were less professional. One example that sticks with me today was being asked in an interview to jump up on the desk, tell a joke, and make the person interviewing me laugh. Now, I was fairly athletic at the time. Jumping on the desk, I was thinking how I would do that strategically. Telling a joke, I had a bunch that were neutral and probably safe, but making someone laugh that you met like 10 seconds ago was basically awkward. Another interview, I was asked to get up and open a window in a high-rise. Now, I had never been in a high-rise in Manhattan. They said it was hot in the room. I walked over, realized you can't open any of the windows. So again, very awkward. But Goldman Sachs was always professional. And that made a lasting impression on me. And as I turned around and was the person interviewing for the next 14 years at the company, I did dedicate myself to certainly screening candidates, but really striving to have them do very well in the interview and to have a good impression about Goldman Sachs, regardless of whether or not we ended up extending an offer to them. Another factor that was important for me was the status and reputation of Goldman. I won't lie, Goldman was a really tough place to get into, and that did inspire me. When it came to money, I think because they had a good reputation, it was actually my lowest offer. I was offered more money at every one of the competitors, but it was one of the only private partnerships left on the street, so long-term compensation was still very convincing. And it was an academic environment, which that did suit me. But the most compelling reason for me to choose Goldman Sachs were their 14 business principles. Reviewing them made me feel really connected. Growing up in a small town, a close-knit society, going to church school, Goldman Sachs culture represented a comfort zone for me. And at Goldman Sachs, culture was everything. You became immediately part of a bigger group. You were surrounded by a lot of really intelligent people. Goldman Sachs had been around since Marcus Goldman in 1869. The hidden message, don't screw up. Everything you do matters inside the firm and outside, so conduct yourself appropriately. Goldman Sachs was still relatively small the whole time I was there. Even when I left in 1998, it was under 7,000 employees. Shortly thereafter, they went public. Today, Goldman's 35 to 40,000 employees. But back to the 14 business principles. They were formative for me, not only for my time at Goldman, but for my career extending well beyond. So let's paraphrase 4 of them that are my favorite. The number one that I'll talk about, and the number one business principle at Goldman was, our clients' interests always come first. So notice, we didn't say our clients are always right. Our clients were very often wrong, but that didn't matter. Their interests certainly came ahead of the firm. Second, we stress teamwork in everything we do. Teams produce the best results. For me, the diversity of our team as it grew over the years was critical. A diverse team gave constant checks and balances for you. It's very important to be surrounded by people who don't think anywhere close to the way you think, no matter how bright they are. The third business principle, and this one I think is very applicable to this course, so I'll read it in its entirety. Our assets are our people, capital, and reputation. If any of these is ever diminished, the last is the most difficult to restore. We are dedicated to complying fully with the letter and spirit of the laws, rules, and ethical principles that govern us. Our combined and continued success depends upon unswerving adherence to this standard. That was absolutely known and lived at Goldman. The last business principle I mentioned is Goldman Sachs' dedication and goal to provide superior returns to stakeholders. No apologies at the firm for economic success. There's no question. Profitability is crucial to being able to serve our clients. Profitability allows us to attract and retain the best people, which again is self-fulfilling and adds stability. Profitability grows your capital base, which allows you to weather many things, again, for your client and for your people. Now, the cynical interpretation in the 80s was that Goldman Sachs just did things right because they're long-term greedy. Okay. I like to think more in Swedenborg parlance and say that serving the neighbor was quite alive at the time. The doctrine of use was alive and kicking. And if nothing else, get your externals in order and your loves will follow. But that's for a totally different talk, not for today. So, what did I do at Goldman? This is a part of any discussion where my wife and kids would start to cringe and say, Dad, don't get too complicated. So, I have no handouts, no slides. It will force me to be disciplined, a very shallow dive. In fact, our favorite acronym at Goldman Sachs, when we were creating these really quite incredibly complicated instruments and trying to describe them to our investors, was the KISS principle, to keep it simple, stupid. So we'll try to follow that here. I joined a few folks at Goldman, literally 3 folks at Goldman, that later would become the structured finance department. It was an intense time, and it was a very creative time, and we started focusing on mortgages. What we were ultimately doing was increasing liquidity through allocating risk. Again, the goal of everything we were doing in the derivatives market was to increase the liquidity of that market by allocating risk in the market. Our major tool was financial engineering or cash flow modeling. There was a tremendous amount of data on mortgages, decades and decades through all different types of economic climates. There was forecasting models to be built, cash flow algorithms to be developed and tested, and of course, everything needed to be documented, and there were no boilerplate documents, so we were starting from scratch. We represented an important point in a long chain that ultimately worked its way back to an individual trying to buy a house. Now back to the 1980s. The 80s there was huge demand in the 1980s for housing, and there simply wasn't enough housing stock. Our allocating of risk and marking that to different investors allowed us to provide that liquidity, more money to those folks looking for housing, and it pushed down rates at the same time. We began with residential mortgages, that's a single family home, moving to duplexes, and then multifamily, apartment complexes, condominiums. Then you work your way into commercial loans, and then other types of asset-backed loans like automobile, equipment leases, and finally to completely unsecured receivables like credit cards. Same process could be applied to an ever-growing universe of assets. And as we did it, you add liquidity to that class, you help the originations, you drop interest rates. Competition. Competition inside and outside of Goldman Sachs was very different. We were fiercely competitive with other Wall Street firms. We wanted to be the best in breed, the first, show how stupid everyone else was compared to how brilliant we were. But internally, we continued with a team approach. In fact, the bonus pool for several years of the analysts, your first few years, was completely non-competitive. It didn't matter which division within Goldman Sachs you worked. No matter how much money you made, you got paid the same bonus. The flip side is, you certainly knew or felt that if you screwed up, you hurt everybody. Back to Goldman Sachs culture. Goldman Sachs' traditional clients were not the folks we were dealing with. Goldman Sachs dealt with what we call blue chip companies. They took these companies public and banked them for their entire existence. So Sears, Ford Motor Company. When I was there, we took Microsoft public. So we were presenting something that was brand new investors that were not the same credit worthiness to start with. And we added a lot of anxiety to the partners. But the management told us what the expectations were, and then it was up to us to earn their trust. They were very disciplined. They told us to walk before we run. They told us to focus, but also be the best that you can possibly be in this industry as soon as possible. So there were a lot of mixed messages. There was nothing taken away from having to be successful, but they also told us we didn't have to rush. We had to research and listen. We had to learn. We had to create and then convince ourselves of what we produced and then convince management to allow us to proceed. During my first few years, we hired a lot of people. We had the pick of anyone that we wanted. Goldman was very hot. It was a luxury, a real luxury to be there. Exhaustive process. Most people didn't get invited back to the office. When you did get invited back, you would see as many as 20 people. And the joke for us interviewing was, especially in the early days, we'd look around a room and see these talented men and women, and we'd say, we would never hire ourselves. We would never, ever make our cut. So it was a rich person's problem, as I say. Again, there was a consistent, dedicated effort in order to produce a strong, diverse team. Now, jumping to the basics of securitization. And by so, introduce kind of the larger community or stakeholders, all in the context of your course for CSR. Originations, this is where it starts. This is back where a bank makes a mortgage loan. You want to buy a house. You need a loan. That's leverage. There's nothing, no matter what somebody tells you, there's nothing good or bad about leverage. It's just a tool. So let's look at a very simple example, no charts again. Let's say that you have, if you wanted to get a mortgage today, you would just go on the internet and search for the best rate. Okay, in 1985, you weren't going on the internet and you weren't searching for a rate. You were going to your bank and asking, please give me some money. Let's say the house was about an average house, $125,000. You'd put $25,000 down, you get a mortgage for $100,000. That mortgage would be a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, and wait for it, the interest rate would be 12%. So in today's rate environment, I don't know what a Fannie Mae 30 years, around 3.5%. You guys have grown up with rates that, your adult life have been a quantum leap from there. And 12% was a really good improved rate from the early 80s as well. That means you have 360 payments, 30 years, monthly payments, of just over $1,000. You're going to spend $370,000 to pay back that loan. $100,000 in principal, $270,000 for having the wonderful pleasure of being able to borrow that money. What is a bank going to do to decide? The bank's going to be very disciplined. In those days, they were extremely disciplined. The underwriting, 3 basic premises. First, your ability to pay. Do you have a job? Do you have a lot of debts? Second, your willingness to pay. Did you attend Bryn Athyn College and have huge student loans 10 years ago and blow them all off? Third, what is the asset worth, your house, a bank appraisal in the event that you fail to pay back your loan? For the most part, this loan, if let's say that they went ahead and gave you the loan, would be immediately bundled with maybe 9 other loans, so that you would have 10 $100,000 loans, and it would look like $1 million large loan, and that would be put into one of these government programs. Now we introduce Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, institutions that have been around almost 50 years at this point. They would basically guarantee principal and interest so that an investor does not have to worry about credit. They would have their own underwriting guidelines. They still would look at a willingness to pay, ability to pay, the asset, but they may give a maximum size of the loan, other things more conservative so you could fit in the government program. And that 12% interest rate on the big security, the pass-through security, would go down a little bit because they get an insurance fee. The government gets an insurance fee, or a quasi-government entity. What did this do, these pass-through securities? They added tremendous liquidity. That's where the market was when you come into the mid-'80s. Many investors could buy it, but investors have a real problem because they still have to buy something that looks like a 30-year window. So use a garden hose example. You got a neat little nozzle, you can turn it on, splits the stream into 10 equal parts. Take your one Fannie Mae security, remember this is essentially, you can think of it as 10 individual loans, $100,000 each, $1,000 a month. That split will give you $1,000 into 10 buckets. 10 buckets in this front row are your investors. That will fill up, they'll get basically $1,000 a month. Perfect. They love that. They don't have to worry about whether somebody defaults. They don't have to worry about who bank A was or B or which loan. They know the government's going to pay. Essentially, they have a AAA rated security. But they got to wait, essentially, this is simplified, but wait 30 years to get paid back. They still all have to wait the same length. It's a pass-through. So in comes the mid-1980s, and we introduce a French word, tranche, meaning slice. So we're going to time tranche these cash flows. This is where the market takes off, really explodes, and the revolution begins. And also introduces my favorite instrument in the world, the collateralized mortgage obligation, the CMO. And we grew into acronyms, went wild. We have the CBO and the CDO and the CLO, everything, collateralized something, obligation, a way of us mixing up cash flows. And again, in doing so, looking for different investors. But that is definitely another conversation with a lot of one detail, which I would love to be a part of and be very animated in. But back to the analogy. If we take that hose and we actually turn it back to a stream, where now we're getting all of the cash flow at the same time, and we fill these 10 buckets up sequentially, if I put that on the first bucket, it's going to fill up $10,000 a month very quickly. By the time I get to the 10th bucket, it's been a long time. It'll be a tighter window, but a totally different profile. Something that an investor may want, a very long-dated asset, versus somebody who wants a very liquid, short-dated asset. So what does that do? It means we find more investors. More investors, we allocate risk based on their preference, and they pay higher prices. And what do higher prices mean? More money. More money, lower interest rates. Once again, we're pushing interest rates down, all the way down, back to the person trying to get a mortgage and buy a house. And the process continues. Whole loans, loans that don't fit into those government programs. They're too big. They have a little bit more risk. Their interest rate moves around. That's all right. We can turn our hose on and we can fill up the buckets. Maybe a loss now. There's no guarantee of the cash flow. Maybe a loss is like air. But that's okay. Bucket number 8 takes all the air. It's called a subordinated bond. They pay a different amount. They have a different risk profile. So we've created something called credit tranching. We've taken the credit risk, we've thrown it back in the pool, and we've allocated it to different investors. Interest rates, that wonderful $1,000 a month that you're paying is actually $1,029 a month. It's the same for 360 months. That's wonderful. If you paid it off, if you own that cash flow and it got paid off, somebody paid off their loan in 1 month, they moved, that's all right. You didn't get 30 years, but hey, you got exactly a 12% return. You just got your money back. What happens if I take that $1,000 and say, all right, the $1,000 interest is one bucket and the $29 of principal is in another bucket? Over the life, it's still $270,000 worth of interest, $100,000 in principal. Principal, you may pay me $30,000. The interest, you may pay me $70,000. It's the same $100,000 that you paid. But what happens when in 1 month you pay off that loan? I paid $70,000 for $270,000 interest. I got $1,000. On the principal side, I paid $30,000 and I got all $100,000 back. I only had to wait 1 month. So again, we've taken the option in a loan and we split it apart, which makes it much more volatile. And we've sold those particular interests. That's interest rate stripping. Lots of different things that we did with all of the cash flows. But enough on the financial engineering. Let's go back to the legal structure. Very complicated structures that we have throughout to protect these assets from the originators. That introduces new community members. Those are all the law firms, the major law firms, at least in Manhattan, and as we bridged out to other cities across the world. What about the tax and accounting structures? Also, a lot of time spent on making sure that we're efficient from tax. If I'm creating 2 or 3 different entity levels, I don't want 2 or 3 corporate levels of taxes. I have to keep it neutral, not have that cash flow taken. Again, that introduces the major accounting firms. So that used to be, for people my age, the big 8. Now I think it's the big 4. There's probably 4 left. Again, each of these new additions have their own corporate cultures and also are part of this larger community. Structuring and managing the deals. That wasn't just Goldman Sachs. We have to introduce all of the other investment banks that were our competitors, each doing their own financial modeling, doing the rigorous forecasting. They're going to change and identify new variables, correlations. They're going to run interest rate forecasts, prepayment forecasts, loss forecasts, again, all through their own models. Ultimately, what they're trying to do is predict what returns will be for various investors so those investors can decide whether they want to participate. Insurance companies, another huge group that would come in and guarantee certain tranches and certain structures. The rating agencies, another huge group, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, S&P, Duff and Phelps, Fitch. These are companies that would give stress tests and say, look, our whole job is to give you a AAA, AA, single A, some corporate rating so our clients, the investors, can know what the credit risk is in the bonds that you're creating. So they have their own models and they require us to run new stress tests to be able to assign ratings. Again, a very large universe. The regulatory environment, basically the SEC. They were about disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. Everything had to be documented to make investors aware. It's very hard to figure out what documentation is to make people aware when saying everything tells them nothing. Technically covering your butt in terms of what happens doesn't necessarily help them understand what they need. So you needed both. And prospectuses that we were writing got very, very long. Anyway, the entire market was very fluid, but our mission was not. We were to be exhaustive in our research, our analysis, and the modeling. We were to debate openly with our diverse team. We were to document, make sure that we own not only the process, but also the end product. And we were to get it right for our clients. And I think most defining for me at Goldman was there was no pressure to do a single transaction. You knew they had been around a long time. It was a huge company, and you simply didn't have to do anything. So if for whatever reason it didn't feel like it was right, don't do it. We were excited to be first and best, but we were also part of a team, and so we shared everything, and that impacted the team. So now, corporate social responsibility, CSR, that framework, basically the theory that a corporation is held to a higher standard than just the legal construct. one that really approaches kind of a responsible citizen in society. 3 major focus areas: economics, that's money; legal, follow the rules; ethics, do what's right even if you're not required. So looking at my Goldman Sachs experience, certainly we were told to make money, profitable, anywhere, anytime. No question there was support that allowed them to continue to do what they do. Legal, we were certainly told you're following both the letter and the spirit of the law. Ethics, Goldman Sachs did expect an ethical set of rules beyond the legal construct, both within the firm and outside. Again, remember, what you do here and outside of the firm comes back and reflects on the firm, so be cognizant of that. 2 quick examples from the ethics, one in my department and one far away from us. We had created a very complicated structure with derivatives, and one of our major clients we did not think was suitable for this, and we didn't offer it to them. We took a lot of heat internally and in the press on how arrogant we were, but again, that was one of those, our judgment call that this was not an appropriate asset. Even though it was a multi-billion-dollar, very sophisticated client, it just didn't fit as far as we saw it. So we stepped up and took a lot of heat. Another example is the hostile takeover business started before my time. AKA, this is corporate rating, green mailing, where somebody goes in with a lot of money on a Saturday and buys maybe less than 1% of an IBM, and then has control because they're so broadly held that they can throw out the board of directors, demolish the company, and they basically say on Tuesday, buy back all my stock at a huge premium or I'm going to screw up your company. All right, kind of ungainly. Wall Street was resistant to that to start with, but since they can charge anything they want, the fees were huge, and one by one, Wall Street supported that corporate rating business. And there's a lot of names in the junk bond world on how that was funded. Goldman Sachs was the sole holdout, never joined that business. And ironically, over the next bunch of years, they developed a business to protect their companies. They created poison pills, ways of basically making the takeover ineffectual, and they made a lot more money that way. So, are they doing the right thing or are they long-term greedy? Who knows? But that's, again, a process that turned out to be very successful. So this brings me to some reflections on 2008, 2000 global meltdown that many of you should be aware of, since there's still, even though technically it was over after a couple years, we clearly have a lot of deleveraging going on throughout the globe today. When you look at mortgage-backed derivatives market, you see how many different entities are integrated into it. Individual consumers use leverage to buy a home. That's a starting point. Nothing wrong with that. Banks originate those loans with rigorous underwriting standards to fit into various programs, Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae, Freddie Mac, and then hundreds of other programs, each with their own rule set. Investment banks structure the deals. Law firms, accounting firms, rating agencies, government entities, all add checks and balances to the process from various perspectives. And the behavior, in the course, investors of every shape and size are involved. This includes banks, insurance companies, pension funds, people invest in your retirement money. Basically, very quickly, it's the whole world. And little lapses can begin to add up. Underwriting the mortgage. Maybe it gets sloppy or non-existent. New products like no documentation loans or strange interest rates get thrown into old models that haven't been updated or recalibrated or ever contemplated this new instrument that just was invented. Deal structuring looks more to what can be done and not what should be done. The rating agencies get pressure and pitted against each other. Look, Standard & Poor's, if you don't give me the rating I want on this, I'm going to go to Moody's. They're already offered me. They're going to get my check. The original focus of understanding and allocating risk to investors loses its definition. And those who know better or should know better do not adequately inform or redirect. And things start to deteriorate, and more individuals in some companies look to covering their own butts. And the 2007-2008 global financial meltdown ensues. Certainly food for thought for this course. A closing thought for you students. There's an active dialogue these days regarding the cost of education and whether you'll be paid enough money in the job to justify it. Looking back over 30 plus years of professional life, I would say confidently that over a career, your compensation could be more fluid than you first might think. And company cultures could be more rigid, good, bad, or ugly. I would encourage each of you to really spend time and energy understanding the culture of a potential employer, and when you find one that fits, that you dedicate yourself to becoming part of its fabric. So now, questions. Yeah.
Starting position, and what was your ending position? I'm assuming that you grew within the company.
My ending position?
Yeah.
Yeah, so because there were some strange directorships which I had, which when investment banking goes public from Goldman, there's a lot of different names. I was director of our vehicles, which did the mortgage-backed securities market. I was vice president, one of many vice presidents within the fixed income division. Yep.
You talked about the
You have to have the mic. If I have this on and can't look left
all right,
or right,
I'll
you
speak
have
to the mic. You talked about the tranching.
Yeah.
Is that the basically clumping together of the different mortgages on individual houses? So you would take 50 mortgages or whatever and clump them together into one tranche?
Right, not exactly. So what you're doing in tranches, that's what pass-throughs were. So you would take a mortgage and you would pass through in a security like a mortgage-backed security, a Fannie Mae, a Freddie Mac, or a Ginnie Mae. The tranching says instead of just passing straight through so every slice looks the same, it's to combine what's coming off of those and filling and directing that in specific ways. So again, they're called mortgage-backed derivatives because there are mortgages that are backed and they're deriving their cash flow from those cash flows. But it isn't like I'll just take this pool and that will represent a tranche. It's more I will take everything coming off of this pool and I will allocate it in a whole bunch of algorithms. Maybe for 2 months I'll give it here and then I'm going to pull it off and turn it on over here. Maybe I'll fill a schedule in one class versus another. And you can see very quickly, if you have $1 billion of mortgages, because a lot of these transactions would reach $1 billion, I may have 100 or 10,000 loans underneath one. You'll realize that even if none of those are rated, they're just folks like you that are going to start to pay back a mortgage. Nobody's guaranteeing the cash flow. If I create one bucket that says, over the next 30 years, $1 goes to here. So everybody will have to completely default. Even though not a single homeowner is a AAA rated, that bond is certainly AAA rated because I've allocated the priority. Now, it wouldn't be very much. If somebody paid me a lot of money for $1, it's not going to basically arbitrage enough cash flow to make me pay more for the pool. But it does show that by allocating that risk in various ways, time tranching, credit tranching, interest rate stripping, you can create profiles of buckets that look nothing like the aggregate pool. And that means you can pay more and more money for that aggregate pool because what you've created are derivatives which meet very specific investors' needs.
And on top of that, you said that when you worked there, you were dealing primarily in terms of homeowner loans, like a 30-day fixed rate?
That's just what was mainly available. But no, everything in the world. Fixed rate became, there was every fixed rate, variable rate known very quickly with the HELOC. What's that?
Coming closer to like 2007, 2008, people were kind of getting a lot more into variable rate.
2007, 2008, where do I see a disconnect is, which is post my time there, but there were a lot of what they call fraud loans. So I'm not even looking at your background loan. And that could mean that, why would people do that? Why would you as a bank, a local bank, make a loan to somebody you know could never pay you back on a house that can't possibly be worth what they're paying? Well, again, it goes back to how responsible are you? If I can make a $100,000 loan and I can sell everything, remember at this point, I'm not retaining anything. In the old days, as a bank, you retained a residual, some interest, so it still mattered how the loans performed that you underwrote. When you're selling everything off, I loan $100, I sell it for $101. I'm going to do that all day long. Not my problem. They bought it. What the heck? That happens all day long. The homeowner, let's talk about the consumer. Why are you buying your fifth house if you don't have a job? Well, they're giving me a loan, and I'm not really sure. But so all the way along the line, people are not kind of thinking about all the stakeholders and what makes sense. And I think that to be fair, I never am the conspiracy theory dude, so I just think it's a lot of little lapses by a whole bunch of people who just are not necessarily responsible that add up, rather than some huge concerted effort to defraud. But there's plenty, it's complicated enough where the inmates can be running the asylums. I mean, Howard Asaki was at Moody's, he wrote the original models with us. Linda Blevins was at S&P. They've been gone for so long, I would say a lot of the authors of these are gone, and people are using technology and structures that they don't own, they don't really understand. And as long as the music's still going, let's just throw the new model, the new mortgage in and sell it off. And when the music stops, nobody has a clue what's in here, and nobody has the time to be able to reverse engineer everything and say, wait a minute.
Thank you.
So with your background at Goldman Sachs, how has, you were talking about CSR and everything like that, how has your background there provided a good foundation of CSR in your professional life today?
Yeah, so what's the last thing is, how's it give me background for?
Oh, so pretty much your background at Goldman Sachs and the practices you use there of CSR, how have they kind of transitioned you to your professional life today, and how do you use them?
Sure. Well, again, I was a victim of Goldman Sachs culture, so in the good sense. When I went to the Brickman group, I joined a company that has 60-year experience, and again, it was the grandson of the founder that I joined, a classmate of mine, Scott. And it had a wonderful culture that was seamlessly similar to my prior life. The client was incredibly important, ethics were everything. So I got to hop into another great culture. When I went on to hedge fund land, some old Goldman colleagues were there, but it's a different animal. Okay, what we were meant to be doing for investors was different, and there was a much bigger appetite to invest. So that culture was much more do things right. And I could say that's, there's some exposure in the hedge fund land in terms of which hedge fund you're at. And then for my own company, that's easy. I mean, the same exact fabric of being responsible in what you're doing and how do you impact everyone seems, very normal at this point.
Thank you. That was a great talk. Lots of information. I want to ask you about gender. And you've been obviously very successful in business on Wall Street and in private business, in entrepreneurial efforts. I know you're also involved with human rights and women's rights through the UN and other organizations. What can you say about any changes you've seen in terms of women's engagement? For instance, in your workplaces, was there an improvement in the percentage of women there, especially towards the top? I mean, I know it's been a struggle there. And do you see, when you talk about these principles, 4 business principles, they strike me as things that women could really make a terrific contribution to. So are you seeing ways that business could be more inviting to participation from women, or the way education could prepare women to be more eager to get into the fray? So a lot of pieces to that, but I'm interested.
Sure. Well, let me start with the last part of your question. I do think it's interesting because having gone to Bryn Athyn College and Lehigh University, the gender issue was, even at an engineering school in the 80s, both genders are equally represented in my experience, and you had healthy dialogue, mutual respect. And the question is, how does that not translate into the workforce, at least for my early career? When I went to Goldman Sachs, Wall Street was as bad a place as anywhere in terms of inequality for women. Even the jokes in the regular paper, you look back thinking what was funny, and you look at it in today's, and it's amazing. I think that having started a department, we had right off the bat, we hired new people. We were doubling each year, and we had gender representation. We had folks from all walks of life too. So everybody wasn't in computer science. We had electrical engineers, a history major. So again, the first two people I hired were Syed Hasnain from Pakistan, who was a computer science major, and Ina Israela, who was the 9th ranked chess player in the world in Russia. So it gave us a latitude, which if I stood back as I am now and able to say, wow, I was just a kid there learning a company I was impressed with and doing a big job. I wasn't taking on sort of where is the gender issue like I do now. I would say there was a ton of work to do. Goldman Sachs, when I was there, it felt really balanced and respectful. The fact is there wasn't a single female partner. In fact, there was not a single, it was a historically, from a religious point of view, a Jewish firm. I think there was one non-Jewish partner when I started there. And that's after starting in 1869. So there was a lot of, and a lot of our competitors were really hostile environments for women. But the mid-'80s were a time where they came out with the building blocks, just the most basics, not the ideal, but the sexual harassment rules, the ideas of raising awareness to say, you can't just do that. You can't just do the following 8 things. You can't ask questions. I mean, you can't ask certain questions of candidates. And a lot of those were gender-based on just being insensitive. So education is the key to everything. I think if you could figure out a way to take what seems like a balanced or even playing field in the academics, and you could move that into corporations in a better way, that would be great. Goldman Sachs has the 10,000 Women, which is an amazingly successful organization. I'm not working there, so it looks great from the outside. I haven't done a deep dive to find out how genuinely and saturated that is in the culture there. But
So, John, I had a question. When you think back now in retrospect, was the financialization models that were used on mortgages, was that a good idea that went bad? Or was that a bad idea that wasn't recognized as a bad idea?
well, I'm totally biased. Again, back to my taking a loan out. I'm not one of the ones who will pound on how evil credit cards are or anything else. They're a tool. You should be disciplined and educated about whether you can afford to use a credit card. If you have money on a credit card and you're very disciplined where you actually, there's very few people, but if you actually won't spend $1 different, if you won't consume a single dollar differently, then it's a free loan. Why wouldn't you ever do that? It's a win-win, a perfect arbitrage. But the much more human story is, no, you get believe in your own press, you get using it, you get a little behind, you do what you can do rather than what you should do. So from financial engineering, I never blame the tools, no matter how sophisticated. When the technology is out there, absolutely. Does it raise the volatility? Does it raise the standard? And are we capable of policing that adequately? Or does human nature allow lapses? And if you have something that complicated and pervasive, do 50 little lapses, which is what I honestly believe happens, turn into a nightmare, not one bad group takes advantage of it. Bad groups, you can take a bad group. Michael Milken, I don't know if any of you, the older people know Michael Milken. We have lots of mementos from the 80s. I have one that has a Second World War hat, Army hat. On the back it's got Drexel Burnham Lambert, 1990. That was the war room. When they were taken over, went bankrupt because of the inside trading, our department went over and took over their entire mortgage portfolio because there was no one else on the street that could adequately liquidate that in a normal fashion. So that was our secret little sneak-in war room. But again, that's a bad actor. Michael Milken, even institutionally, was bad, but that company just went away. Wall Street didn't go away. Homeowners didn't, default on their loans because of that. Everything didn't implode. Confidence wasn't lost. It was sort of isolated. So it's much more along the lines, I think, of this. I think your course is so on point. Is how do we really, are we cognizant of that? And then, yes, can you create an industry and build on it and have leverage that you know full well we're not going to deal with well? Yeah, so where should the energy be put? And I don't know. That's for people a lot smarter than me.
So I just want to thank John and thank the students and thank the alumni that are watching on live stream right now. And I think that we're out of time. So thank
All
you
right.
very much.
Thank you.